We're pleased to be partnered with the Broadcasting Board of Governors as we continue our monthly series on topical research findings from various markets around the world. This effort is in support of BBG's mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. Today we're going to take a look at Iraq. Gallup's had a very interesting last 10 years of activities in Iraq. Over the last 10 years, we've collected 1.6 million surveys and conducted over 500 focus groups. In fact, it was shortly after the activities occurred in mid-2003 that Gallup began activities in Iraq with an initial survey of Baghdad. So we've had a long history. It's been a very dynamic market to watch, and I know you're all interested in hearing some of the latest findings coming out of the country. Our next event is still to be determined, but it looks like it'll be sometime in May, so stay tuned on the BBG website to figure out what that next event will be. Our first speaker this morning is Mr. Bruce Sherman, the Director of the Office of Strategy and Development at the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Bruce?
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody. Just a few words of welcome and introduction for BBG and why we do this series. We believe very strongly in sharing with the public. We're a publicly funded institution, taxpayer funded, so we take this opportunity to make the public aware. I think it is, right? Yeah, it is on. Take this opportunity to share with the public research findings from around the world. We do the series regularly with Gallup. Iraq is a country that we also have studied for many years. It's a priority country for the BBG. It obviously is a very troubled place, continues to be. Very important for us in the work that we do through our broadcasting in Iraq, both with Al Hurra Television, Radio Sawa, Voice of America in the Kurdish areas, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's service also in Arabic for Iraq, to understand the markets, understand the audiences on an ongoing basis. We believe profoundly at BBG that we cannot reach audiences that we do not understand. So research is, in the first instance, critically important to everything that we do. We're a research-driven organization. We're very pleased to combine in the work that we do not only our media research that Gallup carries out for us, but to have access to the world poll information, which is at the first part of this presentation, to understand what's on people's minds, to understand how they think about their lives, how they think about their governments and societies. And we roll that up along with the media information to be able to determine how best to program to these audiences, given everything that's going on an ongoing basis. So again, welcome from the BBG. We're happy to host this series, and we look forward to a great presentation today.
Thank you, Bruce. Our first presenter this morning is my colleague, Mr. Mohammed Yunus, who's a senior analyst and senior practice consultant at Gallup. Mohammed's going to share with us some findings from the Gallup World Poll. Our work in Iraq from a nationwide standpoint really began back around 2005, so we've got a long trend line, and Mohammed's going to share some interesting findings with us this morning on the environment in Iraq. Mohammed?
Good morning. Thank you, Chris. Welcome back to Gallup for those who are return guests. As Chris mentioned, I will be sharing some of our World Poll data to give a national context to the very interesting media data that is from a separate survey. So the data I'll be sharing is from the World Poll. I'll be sharing with you 3 waves of data, starting with September 2003 through December of 2013 through December of 2014. The way I'll be doing that, and I feel Diana definitely is going to do as well, is really have a conversation about the different areas and communities within Iraq. There's definitely a lot to look at in the sort of nationwide data, but to really get an idea of the granular experiences, really the contrast in realities, in narratives, in faith in the government to life evaluation, et cetera, you really will see a different picture from region to region in the country. So we wanted to focus our approach this morning, looking at the data a little bit differently than we usually do with some of our World Poll presentations. As Chris mentioned, the World Poll is an effort that is self-funded and started by Gallup in 2005. So this is our 10-year anniversary of the World Poll. We are currently in all of the countries you see lit up on the map, about 160 a year. We do all of our surveys in local languages using local experts. So it's a very nationally representative study, but also really strives to be a very local and sort of indigenous experience for the respondent. In Iraq, and the data I'll be sharing with you today, we are using a phone survey. Previously in Iraq, we have been using face-to-face interviews, as we do in most parts of the Middle East. But due, obviously, to some of the security concerns with our partners on the ground, we have switched to a mobile and landline survey in Iraq. As I mentioned, the 3 waves of data I'll be sharing are from September 2013, and then 2 from 2014, ending in December. So it really spans a very interesting period of time politically in the country. There was a lot of turmoil, there was a change in leadership, and there was a pretty serious deterioration of the security situation. It's a nationally representative survey of all adults 15 and older. The sample size for each of these waves is about 1,000 respondents, which is typically what we do for the World Poll. And the margin of error is about 3.8%. So if you don't see a change from one period of time to another that's about 4% or more, that's statistically the same. The survey in Iraq is conducted in both Arabic and Kurdish. So I'm going to use this slide really just to show you and talk to you a little bit about the different regions we're going to use to explore the data. This is just our question on media freedom. Does the media in your country have a lot of freedom or not? This is a question we ask everywhere in the world. Obviously, very sharp regional differences in December of 2014. But if you look at the bottom, this will be what we're going to call southern Iraq. This is basically Babil to Basra. It's a Shiite majority part of the country. To the west, we're calling ISIL-controlled areas, is primarily Anbar and Nineveh. Baghdad is now increasingly becoming a Shia majority city, although that is a relatively recent development. The Sunni majority areas in the disputed regions include places like Salahuddin and as well as other areas in that part of the country. The Kurdish region includes places like Erbil and Duhok. Just wanted to sort of show you the fingerprint of our respondent pool. Obviously, overwhelmingly young, as the country is. But if you look at the bottom, some very concerning data in a country that really shouldn't have economic metrics that are this poor. Food insecurity, measured in the World Poll as experiencing in the last 12 months a period in time in which you did not have enough money to buy food that your family needs. 47% of Iraqis in December of 2014 said that that was the case. The same with money for shelter, and 59% of them saying they're finding it difficult to get by on present income. So now that we kind of have a snapshot of what's going on and we understood the regions that we're going to use to unpack it, I want to tell you a little bit about sort of the items I'll be sharing with you. Very quickly, I'll go through life evaluation, attitudes about the economy, and then delve into political leadership and confidence in the military. Life evaluation on the World Poll is primarily measured by 2 questions, asking respondents to evaluate their lives on a scale from 0 to 10. 10 is the best possible life, 0 is the worst. We ask respondents to evaluate their life currently and what they think it'll be in 5 years. If they answer at a 7 or higher for their current life and an 8 or higher for their future life in 5 years, they're placed into the thriving category, which is the best category. To be in the suffering category, which is the worst, you have to be at a 4 or below on both. And what we saw in Iraq is a very noticeable decline in the rate of respondents who are thriving through the period from September to May to December of 2014. Most notably, obviously, in the ISIL-held areas, as you would expect, and the disputed areas, where people's life evaluation pretty dramatically crashed. The interesting thing to note is, Baghdad and the Shia majority areas, southern Iraq, have seen a rebound, but that rebound is not necessarily reflected in some of the economic data that we'll be looking at in a second. So overall, the country, in December of 2014, more than half of Iraqis described the current economic situation in their country as poor. Less than 1 in 5 gave it any measure of a positive assessment, whether excellent or good. When you look regionally, what you find is that perceptions of a poor economy really do cross over all of those political or ethnic sectarian sort of differences. So a majority of Iraqis in all regions in December of 2014 said that the economy was poor, we describe it as poor, and that perception, that worsening perception, was sort of consistent across all regions. Confidence in each of the following. This is about the military. We ask about a series of national institutions in the world poll in countries across the world. This is confidence in the military from September 2013 to December 2014. Now, keep in mind, ISIL takes control of Mosul in the 10th of June 2013. Maliki steps down from office August 15th of 2014. So this is before and after, basically, the collapse of the military and then return of a more inclusive sort of national government. So we did see a little bit of confidence returning or increasing, improving, again, in Baghdad, in southern Iraq. But in ISIL-held areas, we still see no rebound or a continuing sort of moving in the wrong direction for confidence in the military. In the disputed areas, we did see a little bit of improvement. It'll be interesting to see the latest sort of military strategy and operations and whether that'll impact, particularly with regards to Tikrit. Confidence in the national government, and this was sort of one of the biggest and most interesting findings for me going through this data. There seems to be a lot of improvement, recovery, if you will, on the political reconciliation front, but that's not necessarily panned out on confidence in the military. So we did see an improving in the confidence of the national government almost across the board. Really, ISIL territory was the only area where it hadn't come back to where it was in September of 2013, but in Baghdad, in the southern Iraq, and nationally, we did see quite a rebound back from that May of 2014 low reading. The Prime Minister himself obviously became a big part of the story in Iraq and what was happening with ISIL. This is a question on basic Prime Minister approval. The question is, do you approve or disapprove of the way Nouri al-Maliki is handling his job as Prime Minister? This is September 2013, when there was a lot of political turmoil, a lot of civil disobedience in Western Iraq with regards to their relationship with the central government, a lot of protests and demands for a more inclusive approach. But you really saw a very significant kind of collapse of Maliki. And this title could really be, this slide could be titled The Collapse of Nouri al-Maliki, because if you look at the ISIL-controlled areas in a very short period of time, it went from, 42% to 20%. Just to give you kind of a point of reference, Mohamed Morsi in Egypt was actually just at 22% 2 weeks before he had to step down from office. So really, it's an exceptionally low approval rating. Again, in the Kurdish regions, even lower than ISIL-controlled territories, which is an interesting thing to consider in the context of media and really the media coverage here in Washington and how we talk about the Kurdish region vis-a-vis Western Iraq. But look at what happens when Prime Minister al-Abadi comes to office. And this is December of 2014. So a pretty significant shift in the positive direction and a pretty significant mandate, really, even in ISIL-controlled areas, to really give this new leadership a chance. Now, keep in mind, a lot has happened since December 2014, and it'll really be interesting to see in our next poll whether or not the military approach, primarily, I mean, very honestly, increasingly relying on Shia community militias and contributions alongside the national army, and whether or not that's going to impact perceptions in Western Iraq, in the disputed areas, and in the Iraqi Kurdistan region on the Prime Minister himself. These are just very quick takeaways. Regions are divided on political opinions, but the bread and butter issues are really what unite Iraqis across sects and across geographies. Confidence in the military is probably the most concerning thing I saw when I looked at this data set, just because of the crucial role it's going to continue to play in the next months, and really the lack of rebound on some crucial, within some crucial communities. Despite the signs of progress on political reconciliation, there's still a lot of work to be done in building people's confidence in the military, and whether or not that's going to happen will really, to a great degree, determine, I think, the ability of the political leadership in Baghdad to really continue to effectively work with the far-off regions to the north and the west. I just wanted to say that the idea of this really was to give you kind of what are Iraqis experiencing nationally. What we're going to have Diana share with us is really how are they understanding what's happening in their country? What is the narrative in which they are explaining to themselves, and upon which really they create their own reality and drive their behavior. So now that we know what's happening in Iraq, I'm looking forward to have Diana tell us how are Iraqis understanding it and getting information on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Our next speaker is Ms. Diana Turacek, the Director of Audience Research for the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. Diana is a longtime Middle East analyst, brings some great depth of analysis and insights to a discussion around the media environment. What is a media environment? There's a lot of discussion around digital activities, and I think Diana will share with us some myth busting this morning. So, Diana?
Okay, thank you, Chris and Mohammed. I first saw Mohammed's data about 3 weeks ago. And when I saw it, obviously one of the things that struck me were the significant variations in attitudes, both over time and within provinces. So, you know, I'm someone whose job is to focus on the media, so my first reaction was, you know, I wonder what the relationship is between those attitudes and media usage. So the presentation today of the data is going to address the data within that context. But before I do that, let me just give you a brief overview of how we collected the data. Once again, the survey was a phone survey, as Mohammed's surveys were. Field work was between 18 October and 2 December with a sample size of 20,015. The survey is representative of all of those living in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan, or about 20 million people. Essentially the same demographics that Mohammed laid out in his graphic early in his presentation. Now, as with any survey, it's really important when you're interpreting the data to have an understanding of what was happening at the time the survey was conducted. So we all know that, you know, there's a lot of fighting and instability in Iraq, and I've given you several examples of that on the top of this slide. I'm sure many of you could add additional examples to that. What really matters, though, in terms of the media environment for this presentation is that not only is Iraq very much at war in several areas of the country, but media are a very important part of that war. ISIL, the Iraqi government, Sunni groups, Shia groups, all are using media to try and shape the narratives of how Iraqis and Iraqi Kurds interpret what is happening on the ground. Media are heavily politicized, and we've seen increasingly we're seeing anecdotal reports from journalists in Iraq that it's increasingly difficult to get balanced and objective perspectives on what is happening on the ground. So keeping that environment in mind, let's look at the data. Now, regarding that question of the relationship between media and attitudes that I brought up in the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to narrow that perspective a little bit to look at an issue that I think a lot of folks here are interested in, and that is the relative influence of digital media versus traditional media. Obviously, with ISIL's heavy use of digital media over the past year, folks have come up with a lot of questions such as, you know, how much influence do digital media really have on Iraqis and Iraqi Kurds? Are digital media more important in influencing those attitudes that Mohammed presented than traditional media? Can we say that one is more important than the other? So let's look at the findings within the context of those questions. Now, the first very simple thing that our data shows us about that question is that television is extremely important and extremely influential. Television remains the only mass media in Iraq in the sense that it is the only media to which almost all Iraqis have access and all Iraqis use on a weekly basis. You can see that 98% of those in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan have access to television, and 95% have watched it in the past week. And you compare those numbers to access and use of the internet, 50 and 40% respectively, and you see there's quite a big difference. The other thing to keep in mind about the internet is that 52% of Iraqis have never used the internet. Now, another point that points to the relative influence of television in Iraq is that it's by far the most important source of news and information. You can see in the chart on the left that 92% of respondents say they use television weekly for news, versus much lower percentages for all other media sources, including digital media. And this holds as well for 15 to 34-year-olds when we look just at how 15 to 34-year-olds, what sources they are using for news. They're also much more heavily using television than any other media. Added to this, further suggesting that television is influential and maybe more influential than digital media, is the fact that significantly more respondents say they trust television than trust the internet. So I think it's important to point out that in Iraq, even though ISIL is not using television heavily, it's still very, very important. And I also think, there's a lot of anecdotal information that suggests that if ISIL could get their hands on television and radio in Iraq and in other areas of the Arab world as well, they would darn well be using it. Remember, one of the first things that ISIL did when they went into Mosul in June 2014 was to, first they scooped up all of the military equipment, US military equipment they could find, but they also took over local television and radio stations, likely knowing that either they could use these sources of information for their own propaganda, or that these sources would be used against them. So just a few examples of why TV really matters in Iraq, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But digital media also matter. And they matter for a couple of reasons, one of which is not because ISIL is using them. Digital media in Iraq matter because access is increasing, number one, and because of the way people are using them. So let's look first at the internet. In the last survey we conducted in Iraq in 2012, 18% of respondents said they used the internet in the past week. This year, 2 years later, or the end of last year, 2014, 40% said they used the internet in the past week. That's a 20 percentage point increase over 2 years. Pretty remarkable. And, actually, when you first see those numbers, you think the increase is too much to be able to justify. Maybe there's something wrong with our data. But in fact, there have been a number of significant infrastructure improvements to Iraq's internet infrastructure that justify these increases. And once again, we can talk more about those in the Q&A if folks are interested. Now, when we're talking about media and the relationship between media and those attitudes that Mohammed brought up, we're not necessarily as interested in how many people have access to the internet as how many people are using it in ways that would enable them to potentially get news and information. And that's what we see in this chart or this box on the bottom of the slide. And you see these numbers, and you see that large percentages of those who are using the internet in Iraq are using it in ways they could potentially get news or to get news. So internet, a minority of the population is using internet in the past week, 40% versus almost all of the population using television, but a lot of people are using it for news. So that suggests internet is pretty influential. Another point that suggests internet really matters in Iraq right now. Among past week internet users, that 40% of the population of Iraqis and Iraqi Kurds who is using internet on a weekly basis, almost as many of them are using internet for news in the past week as are using television. So 82% of past week internet users are using internet in the past week for news versus 36% nationally. And, once again, those numbers are quite remarkable. And when I look at the data for internet, this is my own interpretation, but, there seems to be something of a magic that the internet has. Yes, only 40% of the population is using it on a regular basis, but they're using it heavily for news, and they really trust it. That's important. So the other point is that significantly more internet users than respondents overall trust the internet. So that's another point to suggest that the internet is influential. Let's now look at mobile phones. So I've heard people say that mobile phones in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East matter because everyone has a mobile phone. And yes, that's true. In Iraq, 92% of respondents say they have a mobile phone, and 6% of people don't have mobile phones, but they have mobile phones, their friends or their families have mobile phones that they can use on a regular basis. But once again, when we're talking about influence, we don't necessarily care so much about how many people have mobile phones as how they are using them. And are they using them in particular in ways that would enable them to get news? And this is what the chart on the right-hand side shows you. Now, the first thing you might think when you see these numbers is that, the first thing I thought was, they're not bad, but, when you compare it to a country such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other Gulf countries where you have a heavy use of mobile phones, and 90% of respondents are using their mobile phones to access the internet in the past week, these numbers look pretty low. But the point to remember with Iraq is this, and with these numbers is this. Remember that 3G services are still not available in most of Iraq outside of the Kurdish areas. So that means that the non-Kurds who are using their mobile phones for these relatively high, some of these relatively high bandwidth activities, and there are quite a few of them, are using them despite the fact that these applications are very, very slow. They're using the internet on their mobile phones, even though it's probably really slow. Once again, my interpretation, it suggests there's something of a magic with mobile phones. People really, really want to use them. So, I've told you that television matters a lot in Iraq. I've told you that internet matters a lot in Iraq. And now I've suggested that mobile phones matter a lot in Iraq. Well, what do you do with all this information? Is there anything we can say about which one matters more than the other? Well, to start doing that, you really need to look at target audiences. So let's do that for a minute. The first target audience I'd like to look at are young men ages 15 to 34 in Anbar in Nineveh. Now, this group is of interest to a lot of folks. Obviously, everybody's always interested in young men in the Arab world for whatever reason. Anbar and Nineveh are of interest, of course, because those are the two provinces where ISIL has taken control. So these guys tend to be much less well-educated and much less economically prosperous than Iraqis overall. So let's look at their media usage. This chart shows what media young men in Anbar and Nineveh use weekly for news. And the first thing that strikes you is most people are using television. Much lower percentages of respondents are using any kind of digital media or radio and printed newspapers. So the first reaction when you see this chart is, everybody has to decide, everybody's got a limited amount of time and they've got to decide what they're going to focus on. So, first looking at this chart, if I wanted to understand what media are influencing young Iraqi males in Anbar and Nineveh, I would focus primarily on television. The others are important, but the numbers aren't high enough for me to really, if I have to prioritize, the numbers aren't high enough for me to really focus on that. But there are a couple of twists here. First of all, look at the SMS number. 35% of young males in Anbar and Ninwa are using SMS in the past week for news. That is pretty close to the 40% of young men overall that are using SMS for news. The other important thing to point out is that we all know that one of the choice digital media tools for ISIL is Twitter. And apparently, over the past couple of years, Twitter has come up with a tool that enables folks in emerging cell phone markets, such as Iraq, to get Twitter feeds without using the internet. So they're getting the Twitter feeds through SMS-like messages. And that's important to know, and that is something that would make you look twice at SMS. But aside from SMS, once again, we go back to that issue of TV. TV seems to be what I would concentrate on, maybe a little bit focused on SMS as well. But before you do that, there's something else to remember. Look at these trust numbers for television. 11% of those in Anbar and Ninwa say they strongly trust television, significantly lower than the percentage of Iraqis overall who trust television, either strongly or somewhat. Overall, trust in the internet among these young men is also much lower than trust nationally. So, when you're talking about what's more important, what platform is more important, this muddies the issue a little bit and says, maybe you have to dig a little bit deeper. And these low trust numbers also suggest to me that maybe the question for these guys isn't what platform should we use, but how can we create messages that these guys are going to trust? What is it that makes them trust or distrust messages? The other twist in this data is that while trust in the internet among all young men in Anbar and Ninwa is relatively low, if you look just at the young men in Anbar and Ninwa who are using the internet on a weekly basis, significantly more of them trust the internet than even Iraqi men overall. So that's something else to keep in mind. So let's look at a different target audience. This is very different from the one we just looked at. These are what I refer to as information hubs in Baghdad. They are people who collect news at least 2 to 3 times a day and share it at least daily. And obviously these guys are of interest, or these people are of interest, because they're interested in news, but also for broadcasters such as MBN, Al Hurra, and Radio Sawa, they can amplify any news that we put out there, because not only are we going to broadcast it, but they're going to be talking about it. So these guys are more well-educated, they're better off, fewer have been displaced. And now let's look at what media they're using for news and information. And here, perhaps not surprisingly, more are using digital media than those young men in Anbar and Ninwa, and more than Iraqis overall are using digital media. But once again, there's another interesting point in this data that we don't want to lose, and that is that sure, they're using internet, social networking, SMS, mobile apps more than Iraqis overall, but they're also using radio and printed newspapers more than Iraqis overall. Those sources matter as well. We've seen in qualitative reporting that news seekers, in particular, will say, sure, I like to get information from television, I like to get information from radio, I like to get information from internet, but I don't want to give up any one, because I don't have a lot of trust in any media in my country, and certainly that's the same in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. So if I use a bunch of different sources, I can get different narratives and different perspectives and maybe get a clearer picture of what's actually happening on the ground. And then also you see that for these guys, that trust in television and trust in radio in particular are much higher than trust overall, among Iraqis overall. So the key findings from this presentation are, that question of what matters more, the internet, mobile phones, television, radio. particularly in a case such as Iraq, where there's a lot in flux. You really need to drill down to target audiences to get a clear understanding of that question. Looking just at aggregate data can be very misleading. The second point I would like to make is that just because ISIL's using it doesn't mean it's the be-all and end-all of communicating with people in Iraq or Iraqi Kurdistan. As I mentioned earlier, I think that ISIL would be using television and radio if they could get their hands on it. And also, just because, depending on the population, just because ISIL is using digital media doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to communicate with the population that you're interested in, or that it is the most important media platform that is influencing the audience. And then finally, on that question that I posed at the very beginning, the relationship between media use and attitudes, well, we all know that's a huge question that I'm not even going to try to answer, but I think you see the variation in the attitudes. You see the variation in the media, the sources of information. And if I had to bet, I'd bet that there is probably some relationship, and it's probably pretty strong. And others can investigate that further. So thank you.
Thank you, Diana. We've got time for some questions here. I've got some colleagues that have microphones on the sides of the room. So if you just raise your hand, state your name and organization.
Dale Lawton from State Department, INR's Office of Opinion Research. When are you next planning to measure, both in terms of media environment and attitudes towards political figures? Like, I'm most interested in the trend line on the current Prime Minister, so I'd be interested in knowing more about future plans.
Rajesh, you want to take that one? Diane, any comments on?
Yeah, we'll be doing another media survey in Iraq this year. So the data will probably receive the data by the end of the year. Very well.
I'm Jim Randall from VOA. I wanted to ask Diana to clarify something, make sure I understand it. We've got internet at 50%, 40%, and 52% of people haven't used it. I want to make sure that, I think, if I've got this right, 50% of Iraqis have access to the internet. 40% have used it in the last week, right? And 52% have never used it at all, even though some of them have it.
Exactly. So
Okay.
some people have access to the internet in their homes, but it's never used.
Thanks very much.
Next question.
Over here. Hi, Steve Crabtree from Gallup. Very nice presentation from all of you guys. Thank you so much. Diana, I was wondering, given the importance of TV in the Iraqi media environment, if you could talk a little bit about the most popular stations in the country, and something about how people get, or the frequency with which people get news from those stations.
Yeah. So one of the questions we ask in our national survey is we ask people to tell us their most important source of news information, of any source possible. And almost everybody names a TV station. The TV stations that tend to be named the most are Al Iraqiyya, Al Sharqiyya, to a lesser